Today on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you live in parts of the South Hills or in the East End, getting around by bus or on the T might be pretty easy for you. But that's not true for big portions of our city and our county. And even if your street is on a bus line, that doesn't mean the bus comes on time, or in many cases, at all. Today, we're with the advocacy group Pittsburghers for Public Transit, talking about what's working, what's going wrong, and their vision for what public transit could be here in Pittsburgh. It's Tuesday, March 12th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Laura Chu-Weens, Executive Director of Pittsburghers for Public Transit. Welcome back to CityCast Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I feel like we've heard your voice so much, but it's nice to be able to sit with you side by side.
It is nice in the not really post-pandemic world to be in the room with other people.
Truly. Let's start with a big one, I guess. How would you say that Pittsburgh Regional Transit is doing right now?
Oof, that's a big one.
I know. There's a lot to it, but you are so well poised to have an idea of how they're functioning, their reliability, what could be better, what you already love.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a challenging time for transit riders because the service has been getting cut every time they do a round of service changes. And so riders are seeing their service frequencies whittled down. Sometimes their stops are getting removed. And a lot of times, even when a bus is scheduled to show, it doesn't show up. And so I think for a lot of riders, that has made it impossible for them to rely on the bus to get to their critical necessities. And we're hoping to turn that around.
Do you ride the system yourself?
I do.
What's your bus? What's your route?
My unicorn bus is the P71.
Okay.
But I take the 61B, 61C, 61A, and I also take the P1. I love the busway.
What makes it a unicorn to you?
Well, it only comes very infrequently, but it is great when it does come.
What do you like about your routes? Like your experience with them, the routine, the regularity when it's there?
Sure. I mean, so I'm very, very fortunate. I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of access to bus service. And this is probably because I live in a more affluent community. I have a lot better access to buses. Not only do I have access to the busway within walking, biking distance, but also there are a lot of buses that come every 15 or 20 minutes from my home. I know that for a lot of riders in the system, that's not true, right? A lot of our members talk about having access to buses only once every hour or once every hour and 20 minutes. And maybe they don't have choices of which buses to take. And so are obligated to transfer sometimes multiple times to get to their destinations.
Yeah. I mean, talk more about that. Like, it seems like when you look at the bus route map here in Pittsburgh, there are concentrations in some areas, but in others, it's hard. It's just huge white space where there are no routes available.
Yeah, I think that, so one of the things that we've seen is that over the last 20 years, service has been cut by 35%. So that means both where the buses are running to, like the coverage of the routes, how frequently they're coming, and also how late in the day or early in the morning they run. We used to have 24-hour service in a lot of communities. There used to be, I think, 13 buses that ran in McKeesport. So in a lot of communities where there are huge elevation changes, it was easier to take the bus even just to get into your neighborhood from sort of the main corridors. We don't see that anymore. And unfortunately, we're in a position right now where all we're seeing is continued cuts. And we want to start pushing our elected leaders and PRT to really come up with a vision for what it would be like to restore the kind of quality of service we used to have.
I know you put out a report not too long ago called Representing Our Routes. It focused on what's missing from how people are getting around here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. Tell me a little bit more about what you found and what the solutions might look like downline a bit.
So the Representing Our Routes report, it was specifically focused on the city of Pittsburgh and sort of laying out for every city council member how important public transit is for their communities, right?
Do you find that they get it?
I think they're getting it more and more. I will say that there are some real transit champions among the current city council members. Of course,
We've had a lot of change lately, of
we've
course.
had a lot of change. And I think that what was really exciting about us putting out this report last February, just about a year from today, was that there were representatives from every city council member's office that came to stand with us and who took delegations from transit riders in their districts to talk through what were some of the gaps in service, especially around service unreliability, and how people are able to or not able to access jobs or food within their communities, and how long it takes on public transit to access those critical needs.
Yeah, there was one stat that I found particularly striking. Over a third of regional transit routes were below 50% reliability for at least a month. Explain that for us. Like half the time the bus either just doesn't come, it's late, it's early. How does that manifest in the real world?
Yeah, so that was looking at the data from 2022, because again, we published this about a year ago. But I think that the issues around service unreliability sort of have persisted. And I think it's hard for non-bus riders to really understand how devastating it is to have your main form of transportation showing up 50% of the time or less, right? It's like that is, you could flip a coin and maybe or maybe not the bus will show up. So the Pennsylvania auditor does an audit of Pittsburgh Regional Transit, I think semi-annually. And this past fall, they released the report on PRT, and there was one fact that stood out to us, which was that between January and June of 2023 of last year, on average, there were 5,500 hours of buses that never showed up per month on average.
So those are your ghost buses.
Those are your ghost buses. And that's astonishing, right? Can you imagine how many people are being left at the curb that are missing the pickups for childcare, that are unable to get to work on time and maybe getting points in a point system, or missing their doctor's appointments and having to schedule for another 3 months out, 5,500 hours. Compare that to what it also said, which was that in 2019, on average in the same time period, it was 250 hours a month of missed trips. So that's a 22 times increase of ghost buses that has happened just over the last 4 years. So it's a really significant problem that has, a lot of poses a lot of challenges for riders.
Yeah, I feel like one thing I've heard from folks before is that, these cuts are happening because people aren't using the buses. That's an argument I have heard. I see your face. But it also seems like even if that were the case, it's a little chicken and egg, because if folks don't rely on the bus, then they're not going to go to the bus stop to try to get on it, because they just expect that the bus will be missing, will be late, will not be able to get them from A to B. So they make another arrangement. What do you say to people who maybe present you with that idea?
Sure. And I appreciate you mentioning that. And you're right, it's a non-virtuous cycle, right? You get cut bus funding, you cut bus service, there are fewer riders. If there are fewer riders, it seems to justify more cuts.
Almost everyone I know would ride the bus more if they believed that the bus would come.
It's like Tinkerbell.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I think, when we had really quality service 20 years ago, or significantly better service and more available service, frequent service, going more places, people rode the bus more.
Well, so why? Why was it so much better 20 years ago?
There are sort of two reasons for why this has been happening. We know one is a sort of a longer term challenge, and one that's going to take longer to fix. And that is the issue of ghost buses, right? And that is primarily a function of the transit worker hiring and retention crisis that exists at PRT. We have a situation in which I think up until now, it's been true for the last couple of years that PRT is losing more workers every month than they are able to hire and retain. Mm-hmm. And so we already had a gap of several hundred workers, transit operators, and also there are maintenance employee gaps. But
it's no small job, the upkeep of these enormous vehicles.
That's right. And I think that a lot of the transit worker crisis has been precipitated. It was originally precipitated by their large firings from the vaccine mandate implementation. So we're at a point, right, where it's still true that there are more people leaving because of attrition, because transit workers were not being hired at a rate enough to
to replace the ones that were retired, had left, whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's also notable that this year and last year, there's a huge spate of retirements because there was a large class of workers that was hired on in the early 90s, and so who are now arriving at retirement age. So this is something that could have been projected, right? Like we should have foreseen this.
Because this is like a really valuable job. It comes with a pension. It has a lot of good qualities to it.
Absolutely. I remember, we talked to a lot of transit workers. We have transit workers on our board and in our membership. And they say that it used to be that you couldn't get a job as a transit worker, it was so desirable that you really had to know somebody in order to even get your foot in the door and people would stay and treat it as a lifelong career.
Yeah, that it's spoken about in that way. Really, even in the last 2 or 3 years, it seems like maybe that's shifting now.
Yeah. So, it continues to be a really good union job. It's a green job, right? Like this is the kind of thing we want to see workers, young people taking on as a career job because it's also serving, obviously, our economy, our environment, our communities. What we need to see from PRT is really a concerted plan to hire and retain enough workers to start closing the gap between the number of workers that they need to be able to run the service that they have, and sort of a projection of when they will have trained up enough people to close that gap and start both effectively running the service that they have on the schedule and be able to restore some of the service that has been cut even over the last couple of years of the pandemic.
Hey, Pittsburgh. Behind those stately red doors on Bingham Street, the brilliant minds at Pittsburgh's City Theater have a brand new stage show for you. It's a modern revamp of the Shakespearean classic Hamlet. Fat Ham follows a young queer black man named Juicy, whose father visits from beyond the grave to demand Juicy avenge his murder. Check it out through March 24th and get your tickets at citytheatercompany.org. Use code CityCast, all one word, for $5 off. Let's talk about potential solutions. How could PRT be better? Let's start with that question of hiring. From your vantage point, are they doing enough to recruit? Are classes going through? How does that work? And what would you like to see change, be different? What do you like?
Yeah, so I think that the challenge is that it's not very clear at what point people are being lost in the system, right? Or when are people leaving PRT? Is it in their first year? Is it during their training period? Is it 3 years down the road? Is it that there are not enough of people applying or not enough trainers to be able to train those that are applying? Mm-hmm. I think that it would be very helpful to see from PRT their assessment of where the barriers are to enrolling more people and retaining more people.
Sort of an internal review.
That's right. And I think, just basic stuff like having an exit interview to be able to assess, are there barriers around childcare? We know that low seniority transit workers are generally obligated to work some of the later shifts or very early shifts, and maybe that's challenging around those with families.
Or routes in neighborhoods that aren't maybe their own.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of, it could be that people are not getting in because of the drug test. And there are new mechanisms now in which you can test for drugs like marijuana in people's systems from just a day or two prior, rather than trying to weed out people who have used marijuana in the last 3 months or something like that.
That was an incredible pun, Laura.
Thank you. Right? I didn't even think about that. I think that the solutions depend on what the problem is. And I think there's not enough clarity at this moment to know what that is. I think one of the things that we suspect would make it a lot more enticing for people to come and stay on is if they collapsed the wage tiers. So right now they have a system in which it takes 4 years for a starting transit worker to receive sort of the base wage for transit operators, which is good, right? I think they make a good living wage, but it takes some time for them to get there. Perhaps if they're losing people in the first year or the second year, it would be a strong incentive for them to stay if they were actually earning as much as their peers doing the same work.
Yeah. Does it ever feel like PRT is maybe being a bit more reactionary than they could be? Like, instead, what if we proactively tried to attract new ridership? And maybe they are. I'm kind of curious what that looks like from where you are.
I can appreciate. So the workforce shortfall is a significant challenge, right? And our members have felt acutely how devastating it is, this last round of service cuts that went into effect in February. The fact that they cut service on these lifeline routes, the 71A, C, and D, with the bus rapid transit corridor in September, we protested against that. We understand that part of cutting the scheduled service is an attempt to ensure that the service that is on the books is actually showing up, right? Is that it's matched to the amount of workers that they have. I think that where we feel like there's still work to be done and where there's some improvement to be made is around the actual writing of the schedules. And that's a separate issue, right? So schedules have been incredibly unreliable. And from our conversations with transit workers, it's apparent that a big part of the problem is that the schedules are written to be unachievable. They're unrealistic, right? So
you mean like literally the operator comes into work and their work schedule just doesn't make any sense?
Yes. So the actual times that they're supposed to be arriving at the stops cannot be made, right? It's not possible for them.
Because of traffic, because of construction, because it really isn't possible even in a perfect Red Seas parting kind of way for them to make it from here to there?
Yeah. So I think it's all those things, right? But there are some things that are predictable about the construction and there's real-time data flowing in.
You're the only person I know who might say that Pittsburgh construction is predictable.
Well, PRT gets real-time data from the buses, and so they can modify their schedule on the basis of that.
They're in a better position than any of the rest of us, no doubt.
For sure. And I think, so workers feel this pressure to try to race to get to the stops and are still consistently 15 or 20 minutes late to every stop.
That doesn't make you feel good about your work performance.
Well, I think it makes their work less safe. I think the thing that impacts them and also lowers morale among the workforce, which may be contributing to attrition, is that many times they're losing their ability to take their breaks. Or even if in theory, they are supposed to be able to take their breaks in the middle of their shift. When you're pulling into the garage for a lunch break 40 minutes after you were supposed to arrive and your next run is starting in 5 minutes, most of the time they feel the pressure to go back out to try to at least get somewhat on time to the stop so that riders can get where they need to go. And so they're losing bathroom breaks, they're losing access to their lunches, and that also makes it hard for them to stop and care for or manage the needs of riders, especially those in wheelchairs. And of course, they should do that, and they do that. I know that it creates a lot of tensions between riders and workers, that they're not only late, but also that they seem to have less time to help support ridership needs.
Yeah. Well, and now Pittsburgh Regional Transit is considering some new changes. They've been doing rounds of surveys. What are you hoping to see come? What are you advocating for within your organization?
Well, I think it is enormously important that they write realistic schedules. And I think this is a change that has happened in the last 2 or 3 years where the schedules are simply unachievable, and they need to be talking to the operators to identify the places in which the schedules need to be adjusted to ensure that workers can conceivably get to the stop on time. There are lots of other issues with the schedule where they could be spacing out the buses more evenly so that it wouldn't be several buses coming to the curb at the same time and then a large gap between the next bus coming, which has also led to issues around overcrowding on some buses and then undercrowding on other buses. And so people would perceive having a higher service frequency if they were actually regularly spacing out the buses in that way. So that's kind of in the weeds. But I think that what's nice about that, if there is an upside, is that it's something that is immediately fixable. And in fact, is something that we raised last year in February with our Representing Our Routes report to say, this needs to happen. And we need city councilmen to be advocates to say that this is a public utility like water, like electric. And if either of those critical utilities were somehow only functioning 50% of the time, they would speak up about it. We want them to speak up around transit as well.
Laura, thank you so much for your work in our community.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you want to know more about Pittsburghers for Public Transit, check out their website or find them on social media. They're also going to be doing a fun event on Monday, March 18th for Transit Worker Appreciation Day. So check them out. And stay tuned here too. We're actually checking in with Catherine Kellerman. She's the top dog of Pittsburgh Regional Transit to hear how they feel about all these questions and what they think they can do short-term, long-term to get riders and operators back on board. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. I say all this. Sophia's actually in charge.